Exhaustion has a smell all its own. Quinn knew it well, rusted metal cut with cheap peppermint, the exact scent riding Ray's breath as he backed her between two wine racks in the cellar beneath the street, Abel's hotel. He thought he'd been clever about it. The dinner rush. 2 floors of concrete swallowing every sound. A woman long trained to keep smiling even while her wrist was being bent the wrong way. He was wrong, because upstairs, in a private room paneled in black walnut, a man was staring at an empty glass. That glass had been empty for 9 minutes. His waitress had never once let it sit past 4. Beneath the table, the mastiff rose slowly to its feet, and Ray Tolliver, still squeezing, still smiling, had no idea he'd just entered a room he would not be walking out of. If you want to know the true cost of that protection, press like to support dark, slow-moving stories without heroes. Share this video with a friend who loves characters living in the gray. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next chapter begins right inside room number 9. 3 weeks earlier, that basement had still been nothing more than a place to store wine, and Quinn Ardley had still believed her life was settled. The Cartwright room occupied the ground floor of the St. Abel's Hotel, and inside it was a private room paneled in dark walnut, with exactly 1 table. Table number 9. Quinn was the only person permitted to serve it. Not because she was the best on the staff. She wasn't the best. She was only the most tired. It was because the man who sat there had requested her. And at the St. Abel's Hotel, no one made August Vale ask twice. Every Tuesday was exactly the same, so precise that Quinn could have set a clock by it. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the wooden door opened, and the temperature of the room changed. Rare steak. No appetizer. No dessert. 1 glass of water. Filled to the top. No ice. No lemon. No alcohol. Never alcohol. In the 3 years she had served that table, he had never touched a single drop, even though the wine cellar beneath their feet held bottles worth more than an entire year of her rent. Beneath the table lay Bruno, a 143-pound Italian mastiff stretched out like a sack of cement that could breathe, his gray skin sagging into folds, his face deeply wrinkled, his eyes sad as though he had already seen too much in the span of a dog's life. In theory, no dog was allowed inside the dining room. In practice, no health inspector had ever written Bruno into a report, and Quinn had stopped wondering why a long time ago. She watched August Vale for 40 minutes every week, and over time she had assembled a portrait of him. He was so large that the leather armchair looked like a child's toy beneath him. Black hair, already turning silver at the temples, cut short and without ceremony. A nose that had once been broken and never reset, left slightly crooked toward the left, as though he wanted to preserve it as a reminder of someone who was no longer there. Pale green eyes, the color of old medicine bottle glass, the kind of color that made people straighten their backs without knowing why. A tailored charcoal gray suit, but no ring, no chain, no piece of gold. Only a scratched steel watch with a black face around his wrist, and Quinn had once thought, with perfect calm, that it was probably the least expensive object in that room, cheaper even than the linen napkin she placed before him. And this was the strangest thing about her life, the thing no one would believe if she told them. Quinn wasn't afraid of him. Table number 9 was the easiest table she had ever served in 9 years of carrying trays. No flirting, no snapping his fingers to summon her, none of the oily looks the brokers in the main dining room wore on their faces like neckties, their eyes sliding from her face downward, and then back up, as though calculating a price. August Vale never looked at her as though she were something on the menu. When he looked at her, he simply saw her, a tired woman, and he knew how to read. That Tuesday night, she poured his water, and her hand trembled. She had worked 11 hours. She had been on her feet since 10 o'clock that morning, and there was a bill lying on her kitchen table at home that she hadn't dared to open for 4 days. Water trembled against the rim of the glass, only slightly. No one else in the entire restaurant noticed. He set down his knife and fork, not looking at her hand but through the window where rain was lashing against the glass, and he spoke in a voice as deep as stones rolling beneath water. "Don't take the subway tonight." That was all. He didn't ask why her hand was shaking. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He offered no comfort, and because of that, it didn't feel like pity. Then he stood, leaving $400 for a $90 bill, and Quinn looked down at the open leather folder, feeling blood rush into her face. "Sir, this is too much. That's the amount I intended to leave." He said it without even turning around, and there wasn't a single opening in his voice through which she could slip an argument. It wasn't an offer. It was an order wrapped carefully in the paper of courtesy, and she had learned enough about powerful men to know when she should remain silent. Bruno dragged himself to his feet and followed him toward the door, and the room became warm again. At the end of her shift, close to midnight, Mercy Latham placed a cup of hot tea on the bar for her, exactly as she had done every night for the past 3 years, and for other girls before Quinn throughout the 11 years she had worked in that restaurant. Black tea, 2 cubes of sugar, hot enough that it had to be blown on before drinking. Quinn picked it up, thanked her, then carried the ice bucket into the rear alley to empty it. The rain had eased. Mercy stood beneath the awning smoking a cigarette, her silver hair pressed close to her head by the damp air. A telephone held against her ear as she said something very softly. She saw Quinn. She closed the phone. Not quickly, not with a start. She simply folded it shut, dropped the cigarette into a puddle, and smiled at her with the smile Quinn had always considered the closest thing to a mother's love she had ever known. "Go home, sweetheart. You look like you're about to break in half." Quinn smiled back. She emptied the ice. She went home. She thought nothing of it. That was what she would regret for the rest of her life. Wednesday morning, and the care facility in Northeast Philadelphia held the kind of light Quinn Ardley spent the entire week waiting to stand inside for 15 minutes. Sunlight poured through the row of tall windows on the eastern side, falling across the vinyl floor in long golden bands, and the common room smelled of weak coffee, lemon soap, and paper. Teddy sat at his usual table beside the third window, and he was drawing. He was always drawing. Crayons, large sheets of paper, 1 picture every day. And the nurses had run out of wall space 2 years earlier, so now they stacked them inside a cabinet with the dates written in marker in one corner. He remembered the names of ships. That was the thing that made every newcomer stop. Every kind of ship that had ever entered the port of Philadelphia. Oil tankers, container ships, grain carriers, automobile carriers, and if anyone was willing to sit and listen, he would recite them in alphabetical order, his voice steady, never stumbling, his eyes fixed somewhere above the listener's shoulder as though the list were being projected onto the wall. In the mornings, he needed help. There were things his hands no longer remembered how to do, and that was all that needed to be said about it. But when Quinn walked through the door, Teddy smiled. Not a polite smile, not one that held half of itself back. His whole body burst into it, his shoulders, his hands, even his head tilting backward, and he called her name twice in a row, as though once could never be enough. And Quinn had to pause at the threshold for a few seconds, every time, every week, to swallow whatever rose into her throat. 14 years earlier, everything had been reversed. Teddy had been the one raising Quinn. He was 17, she was 13. Their mother had been dead for 4 years, and their father was wherever their father was, a place with a number, visiting hours, and a thick pane of glass. Teddy left school in October. He didn't ask anyone's permission. He simply stopped going, went down to the docks and asked for work unloading cargo, added 2 years to his age, and no one bothered to check. Every evening, he returned to their apartment in Port Richmond with his hands black with oil all the way to the wrists and a takeout box from the Vietnamese restaurant at the end of the block for his little sister. He never called it a sacrifice. He only told her what kind of ship had come in that day. Now everything had reversed. $2,400 a month. And Quinn Ardley had stopped counting tips in dollars a long time ago. She counted them in Teddy's days. A drunken broker throwing $60 onto the table to impress his girlfriend was 3/4 of a day. A good night, a Friday night with a corporate party and no one vomiting on the carpet, was 4 days. On a bad night, she picked up a morning shift at another restaurant and slept for 4 hours. She had done that calculation so many times that it ran automatically behind her eyes like a news ticker that never went dark. Even while she smiled at customers, even while she poured water for a man who left $400 without bothering to look at the bill. Teddy had a gift for her that day. He waited until she sat down, then pushed the paper across the table with both hands, carefully, the way someone might pass something fragile. He had spent 3 days drawing it. A pier, gray water, 4 cranes rising like 4 long necks, and in the lower right corner, painted on the concrete in the yellow used for warning signs, was a number. The number 4. "You drew this beautifully," Quinn said, and she meant it. She knew nothing about art, but she knew those cranes stood correctly, stood like things that were truly heavy, and she couldn't understand how a man who hadn't left this building in 7 years could remember them with such precision. A young nurse passed carrying a stack of towels, glanced at the picture, and laughed cheerfully. "He keeps drawing that place. He's been doing it all month. Give him fresh paper, and he draws the same place again. He won't draw anywhere else. Teddy didn't look up. He was choosing another gray crayon. Quinn smiled, rolled the picture into a narrow tube, slipped it into her coat pocket, and thought nothing more of it. She kissed her brother's hair. She told him she would return on Saturday. He said the name of a Greek grain carrier, and she said, "Yes, that's right, that one is beautiful," though she had never seen it, and had never seen any ship in her life. On her way out, in the corridor with the double glass doors leading to the parking lot, she caught sight of herself in the reflection. A 27-year-old woman who looked 35, auburn hair tied back with a cheap elastic band, and running along her left cheekbone, thin as a strand of thread, was a scar. She had never told anyone where it came from, not Mercy, not anyone at the Cartwright room, not even Teddy, and Ray had never told anyone either. It was the only thing the two of them still kept between them. At 6 o'clock that morning, exactly 8 3/4 miles south of the care facility in northeast Philadelphia, the Delaware River was breathing out fog. It was so thick that the 4 cranes at Pier 4 had become nothing more than 4 shadows, and a ship's horn echoing from somewhere near Camden sounded like one enormous animal calling to another. Here, at this hour, the city of Philadelphia pretended to be nothing. It was wet steel, diesel fuel, and 40 men standing in an uneven arc around a rust-red shipping container that no one in the records admitted allowing inside. A man named Dooley was speaking very loudly. He was the foreman of Crew 2, thick-necked, his face red from the cold and from something else, and he had been speaking loudly for 7 minutes. He spoke about fairness. He spoke about how Crew 1 had taken 3 shifts in a row that week. He spoke about people in this city who sat in heated rooms and decided who was allowed to eat. 40 men listened, and several of them began to nod, and that was precisely why that morning mattered. August Vale arrived on foot. No vehicle, no entourage. He walked from the dock gate along the crane tracks with both hands in the pockets of his wool coat, and about 100 feet behind him was Oz, standing motionless as a post, one hand resting lightly, his eyes sweeping the area. Beside August was Bruno, lumbering forward like an overweight shadow, his claws scraping softly against the wet concrete. No one called out. No alarm sounded. The 40 men simply realized, one after another, like a wave moving backward through them, that someone had just entered Pier 4. The arc opened. Dooley was still talking, and August said nothing. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, about 13 feet from Dooley, and stood there. He didn't fold his arms. He didn't frown. He simply stood and watched, and that gaze carried such physical weight that Dooley began to hear his own voice. That was the worst thing that could happen to a man shouting before a crowd. His voice grew quieter, then quieter still. Then he lowered it completely, not because he wanted to, but because its former volume had suddenly become ridiculous inside the silence the other man had brought with him. Only when the entire dock had fallen completely still did August speak, and he asked just one question. His voice was deep, almost intimate, quiet enough that Dooley had to lean his head forward to hear, yet clear enough that the other 40 men heard every word. He asked about Dooley's wife. He asked whether she had been well lately, whether she still worked at the pharmacy on Frankfurt Avenue. Then he asked about the money Dooley had borrowed from a man named Boyd in Fishtown in February, a debt that, as of that morning, was 11 weeks overdue. Then he asked the final question. He asked whether Dooley wanted those two things to meet. Dooley stood there with his mouth slightly open. The blood drained from his red face so quickly that it looked as though someone had pulled a plug. He didn't answer. No one answered for him. August didn't repeat the question, because August Vale never said anything twice. 4 minutes later, Dooley left Pier 4. He walked away carrying his canvas bag, looking at no one, and no one watched him go. The 40 men returned to work. Crane number 2 started with a long metallic shriek, and by 7 o'clock, the rust-red container was somewhere else, and no one remembered that it had ever existed. No one mentioned the incident again, ever. Violence, in August Vale's judgment, was an expensive tool. It was loud. It left evidence. It created widows, and widows remembered for a long time, and memory was the only possession money could never buy back. It should be used only when every cheaper method had been exhausted. He had seen too many men swing their fists simply because there was nothing else left in their pockets to draw, and he had never mistaken that poverty for strength. On his way back toward the gate, he passed the concrete wall beside the base of crane number 2. Mounted there was a small bronze plaque, about the size of a book, stained green by more than a dozen seasons of sea salt. A list of names had been engraved upon it. Workplace accidents, spanning 10 years and more. No one stopped. No one read it. 40 men passed it twice each day, and they had stopped seeing it long ago, the way people stopped noticing a stain on their own ceiling. The fourth line from the bottom contained 3 words and a number. Wendell Latham, 24. Bruno stopped. The Italian Mastiff lowered his wrinkled head, lifted his nose toward the bronze plaque, and sniffed. 1 second. 2 seconds. August had walked 3 more paces before realizing the dog wasn't following. He didn't turn around. He gave one short, dry whistle, and Bruno lumbered onward. August reached the St. Abel's Hotel at 7 o'clock. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since he was 11 years old. The telephone vibrated at 9:20 that night, while Quinn was folding napkins in the employee changing room, and she answered because the screen showed an unfamiliar number, and because there was only one reason in her life why an unfamiliar number would call at that hour. The facility, Teddy. She had trained that reflex for 7 years, and it was faster than fear. She pressed the telephone to her ear and said hello in the falsely calm voice she reserved for calls like this. Hello, Quinn. And the world stopped. Not because he shouted. If he had shouted, it would have been much easier. The frightening thing was that he was sober. No slurring, no swallowing his words, none of the broken rhythm she had learned to recognize from a single breath. It was a calm, slow, almost gentle voice. The voice she hadn't heard in 4 years, and had loved for 2 years before that. She said nothing. She stood in the middle of the changing room with a napkin in her hand and listened to the breathing of a man who was somewhere at a distance she couldn't measure. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I know what you think I'm calling about. I'm not. That isn't why I called. Her throat was so dry that when she opened her mouth, the first word broke in half. Then what do you want? A silence. Then his voice, still calm, still gentle, still the voice of the man who had once sat on the kitchen floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, repairing a broken blender, simply because she said she missed the smoothies their mother used to make. I need you to sign something. Then he ended the call. No explanation. He didn't say what she had to sign. No threat, no meeting place. Nothing she could seize and argue against. He left only a 6-word sentence lodged inside her mind like a shard of glass no one dared pull free because the bleeding would begin only after it came out. Quinn lowered herself onto the plastic chair in the changing room and remained there for a very long time. Ray Tolliver had once been a firefighter. This was the part no one believed when she told them, so she had stopped telling it. The entire Port Richmond neighborhood had loved him. The elderly women at St. Anne's Church still called him the Tolliver boy even after he turned 30. He had once run into a burning house on Belgrade Street and carried out a child, and the local newspaper had printed his photograph on the front page, his face covered in black soot, the whites of his eyes stark against it, and Quinn had cut out the picture and fastened it to the refrigerator with a pineapple-shaped magnet, and she had left it there for 3 years. He was the one who drove Teddy to therapy throughout the first 2 years. That was the part people truly couldn't understand. He remembered every appointment. She never had to remind him. He set his alarm 45 minutes before his shift, parked in the shade so the light wouldn't hurt Teddy's eyes when they came outside, and memorized the names of ships, even the long Greek ones, solely so her brother would have someone to talk to on the ride home. Once, Teddy pronounced a name incorrectly, and Ray corrected him gently, without laughing. And Quinn sat in the back seat looking at the nape of his neck and thought she had married the right man. Then came a back injury, a falling beam at another fire, an operation, an orange bottle of oxycodone with a white cap, then a second bottle. Then the doctor stopped prescribing it. Then came something else, something cheaper, something people bought in the parking lot behind the laundromat. And this was what Quinn could never forgive herself for. There was no specific day when Ray Tolliver became someone else. There was no morning when she woke and found a monster lying beside her. It drifted. It slid, 1 fraction of an inch at a time, so slowly that no human eye could catch it. And she had lived inside that house for 6 years, slept beside him, washed his shirts, counted the bottles in the medicine cabinet, and she hadn't seen it happening. People kept asking why she hadn't left sooner. No one understood that there had never been a threshold to cross. There had only been a slope, and she had descended it in steps so small that not one of them had ever been large enough to call a decision. She had a scar along her left cheekbone. She never told anyone where it came from. Ray never did either. 3 weeks passed. There were no more calls, no messages, no unfamiliar numbers, no shadow waiting at the end of the street when she came home. Quinn emptied ice buckets, folded napkins, poured water for table number 9, and night by night, She slowly loosened the fist she kept clenched inside her coat pocket. By the third week, she had almost begun to believe that he had given up. That was her second mistake. Tuesday, 8:32 in the evening, and table 14 wanted a bottle of Barolo. Quinn wrote 5 bottles on the order slip, refilled the water glass at table number 9 as she passed, then pushed open the stairwell door and went down. The wine cellar of the St. Abel's Hotel lay beneath 2 floors of concrete, and down there, the city of Philadelphia didn't exist. No clatter of silverware, no piano, only the steady breathing of the humidity control system and the scent Quinn had loved for 3 years. Damp oak, dust, and something sweet, like fruit considering becoming something else. She walked along the aisle between 2 wine racks, her fingers brushing the labels as she searched for the Piedmont section. Then she stopped. Ray Tolliver was standing at the far end of the aisle. He had entered through the delivery door. That was the first thing her mind managed to piece together, and it did so slowly and mercilessly, because he knew that delivery entrance. He had rung the bell there every Thursday for a year and a half, back when he delivered charitable food for St. Anne's Church, and the chef at St. Abel's still saved boxes of meat nearing their expiration date for him, and he had once stood on those steps discussing football with the elderly security guard named Nunzio. He hadn't broken into this place. He simply knew the way inside. "I didn't mean to frighten you," Ray said. He was so thin that his coat hung from his shoulders as though from a hook. His blonde hair was greasy. On his left wrist, where the anchor tattoo had once been, there was now only a distorted stain of ink stretched across tight skin, but his eyes were clear. Still clear. "I called, but you didn't answer. I only need 5 minutes." Then he pulled a sheet of paper folded into quarters from inside his coat. He opened it with both hands, carefully, almost ceremonially, and held it out toward her. Quinn didn't take it. She only read the bold heading at the top of the page beneath the cellar's yellow light. A sworn affidavit, a retraction of witness testimony in an assault case from 4 years earlier. "You sign it," Ray said, his voice quiet, trembling, pleading. "You sign, the lawyer files it, the court reviews the case, and I can have the conviction cleared. If the conviction is cleared, I can apply for my firefighting certification again. If I get my certification back, I get to live again, Quinn. Not live well, just live. I'm not asking for much." He released a ragged breath. "You're the only person who can sign it. On this entire earth, only you. No one else can do this for me." And for 30 seconds, he almost convinced her. That was the truly terrible part, the part Quinn would never tell anyone. Not even herself. During the nights that came later, he cried. Not the kind of crying meant for performance. He cried like a 31-year-old man standing at the bottom of a well who knew with certainty that he would die there. He repeated the names of 2 grain carriers, in the correct order, with the correct pronunciation, including the long Greek name he had memorized 7 years earlier only so Teddy would have someone to talk to on the way home. Then he said this. "I still visit him, you know? Last month. He still remembers me. He drew me a picture. That pier, you know the pier I mean? He keeps drawing it." Quinn went rigid, 1 vertebra at a time, from the base of her skull downward. The rolled drawing was still inside the pocket of the coat she had left upstairs. 4 cranes, the number 4 painted yellow on the concrete. "You aren't allowed near him," she said. "Why not?" And his voice changed. Not suddenly. It slid. It slid the way a door closes so gradually that no one in the room notices it moving until someone tries the handle. "I haven't done anything, Quinn. I drove him to therapy for 2 years. Who drove him? I did. And you carry trays for men in suits. And what do you think that makes you?" And Quinn Ardley erupted, for the first time in 6 years, not into a shout. Her voice was even lower than his, low and flat, and she heard it coming from her own mouth as though it belonged to a stranger. "You never once pushed that chair up the sidewalk." Ray stood still. "The ramp in front of the house. Do you remember? You would stand at the bottom, take out your telephone, and call someone. Every time. Every single time. There was suddenly a very important call at that exact moment. 6 years, Ray, 6 years, and you never pushed him up at once. You drove him for 2 years, yes, and every time we came home, I was the one who carried him up the steps while you sat in the car." Something went dark behind his eyes. He reached for her. The bottle of Barolo in her hand struck the edge of the rack and shattered, and wine spread across the concrete in a black pool beneath the yellow light, dark and thick, looking like something far worse than wine. Her wrist was twisted behind her back. White pain flashed along her arm, and she didn't scream. She had been trained too well, for too long, too thoroughly, to scream. 6 years had taught her body that screaming only made everything worse, and that reflex was more loyal than the instinct to survive. He forced her backward between the 2 wine racks. His breath struck her face, rusted metal mixed with cheap peppermint. Then he raised his hand. He didn't go down to the cellar because of a scream. No scream could have risen through those 2 floors of concrete, and even if one could, Quinn Ardley wouldn't have screamed. He had known that about her since the first year. He went down because of an absence. His glass had been empty since 8:41. August Vale knew because he always knew. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't count. He simply knew, the way a man reads a balance sheet and immediately sees which number is lying. He had survived 34 years in this city because of that ability, because he could read time the way he read ledgers, because in his line of work, time was always the first thing to betray a person. 8:45 was normal. She had 11 other tables, and one of them belonged to the brokers outside, the kind of men who snapped their fingers 3 times in 4 minutes. 8:47 was still acceptable. The kitchen might be running behind. 8:50 had never happened. Not once in 3 years. Bruno rose before he did. The dog couldn't read a clock. He only knew that the woman who smelled of black tea and cheap hair elastics hadn't returned, and that was wrong, and he pushed himself up from the rug beneath the table with the heavy, deliberate manner of something enormous that had just decided the evening was over. August set down his knife and fork. He wasn't angry. That was what no one in Philadelphia understood about him, not even the people who had worked for him for 10 years. Anger was noisy. Anger made people raise their voices, move too quickly, and leave marks on surfaces someone else would later have to clean. Anger was a luxury reserved for men who didn't have to answer for the consequences of their own actions. What he felt was the temperature inside him dropping, a calmness that slowed his heartbeat, deepened his breathing, and made everything within sight suddenly sharp as a razor. Every grain in the walnut paneling, every speck of dust inside the circle of lamplight he had ordered lives ended. He didn't pretend otherwise, not to anyone else and especially not to himself, but his violence was work. It had records. It had reasons that could be written in complete sentences, and most important, it had a stopping point, a point at which a man stopped, even if his hand was still raised. What he couldn't endure, the one thing in this world that made the temperature inside him fall below anything he could name, was men who used violence to make themselves feel larger. Men who were only powerful inside locked rooms. Men who chose carefully, chose the busiest hour, chose 2 floors of concrete, chose someone who couldn't fight back and had been trained not to scream. At 11 years old, August Vale learned that an apartment could be silent in 2 very different ways. He never said what the second way was. He told no one, and he would die without telling anyone. He stood. He didn't rush downstairs. He walked through the main dining room, through the stairwell door, down 2 floors of concrete, and the sound of his shoes on the stone steps was as steady as a metronome. Bruno lumbered behind him, his claws scraping softly. August reached the cellar door and didn't enter. He simply stood there, filling the entire frame, and waited. He waited until Ray Tolliver saw him. The raised hand stopped in midair. 3, August said. Bruno growled. He didn't bark. It was a low, prolonged sound rolling up from somewhere inside that 143-pound chest, like stones tumbling inside a steel drum, the kind of sound the human body understood before the mind could translate it into words. Ray's spine curved involuntarily. 2. Ray released her. There was no 1. August crossed the 13 feet between them in 3 strides, seized him by the collar, and pinned him against the concrete pillar in the center of the cellar. No punch, no kick, not a single blow. He only held him there with one hand, his arm extended, the way someone might hold back a door trying to swing shut, tight enough for Ray Tolliver to understand with his entire body, not merely with his thoughts, that the distance between him and the end was now no thicker than a decision he had no right to participate in. August's face was 1 foot from his. His voice was no louder than when he spoke to a server. The past is dead. Come near this building again, or come near this woman again, and you'll follow it. Then he threw him out. Ray struck the delivery door, scrambled to his feet, and disappeared into the wet alley behind St. Abel's without looking back once. August took a white handkerchief from his breast pocket. He wiped his hand, 1 finger at a time, slowly. He folded it and placed it in his trouser pocket instead of returning it to his breast pocket. Finished. Then he turned to look at Quinn. She was leaning against the wine rack, breathing, her hair fallen loose from the elastic, while the Barolo spread toward the toes of her shoes. She looked at him, and that was what made August Vale pause for half a second. The only half-second of hesitation he showed that entire evening. She wasn't afraid. It wasn't fear. She was calculating. She stood amid the broken glass and looked at him in a way no one in this city had looked at him for many long years. The way someone looked at a door that had just opened and tried to determine whether it led outside or into another room. "Get your coat, Quinn," he said. "Your shift is over. Adrenaline is a liar. It convinces the body that it is fast, that it is strong, that it can remain standing, that it can escape, and it keeps that promise with perfect kindness until the exact second it evaporates and drops a person to the ground." Quinn Ardley made it 7 steps from the rear entrance of the St. Abel's Hotel before her knees turned to wet paper. She sank onto the edge of the sidewalk with one hand gripping a lamppost, rain falling directly onto the back of her neck, and realized she was breathing like someone who had just run the entire length of a bridge. The black Mercedes was parked right there, long, low, and heavy, in the particular way only an armored vehicle could be heavy. Oz was already standing beside the rear door, a man whose neck was thicker than the lamppost she was holding, and the rain struck his suit in dark streaks, and he didn't blink once. He didn't help her up. He merely opened the door and waited, and somehow that was kinder. Quinn crawled inside. Bruno had taken up 2/3 of the back seat. The Italian Mastiff regarded her for a long time with the ancient, mournful gaze of a breed that had guarded doors for human beings since the days of Rome, then lifted his head and lowered it into her lap as though the matter had already been agreed upon somewhere by people with the proper authority. The weight pressed down across both her thighs, warm and damp and real, and Quinn sat perfectly still. August occupied the other end of the seat, and he didn't stop the dog. He only looked for 1 second, then 2, before turning toward the window. That was what Quinn would return to again and again on the nights that followed. More than the concrete pillar, more than the growl. He hadn't called his dog away. The vehicle began to move. The city slid past the tinted glass in blurred streaks of neon, and there was no sound inside the cabin except the windshield wipers and the rasping breath of a very large dog. Quinn's throat felt like sandpaper. There was a bottle of mineral water in the center compartment, glass, cold, beaded with condensation. She reached for it with the hand that hadn't been twisted behind her back, tried to turn the cap, and her hand shook so badly that it slipped. A second time. A third. She looked down at her hand as though it belonged to someone else and thought, with perfect calm, that this was it. This was the true humiliation. Not the wine cellar, but this. Then a hand covered hers, large, calloused, the knuckles thickened by something she didn't want to know about, and warm. Quinn froze. He didn't snatch the bottle away. He only steadied her hand for 1 beat, then took the bottle from her trembling fingers, twisted the cap with a single motion of his wrist, producing 1 clean, dry crack, and handed it back. The same hand. 10 minutes earlier. She drank. The cold water went down and hurt, and the pain brought her back to herself. "I didn't ask you to help me, Mr. Vale," she said. Her voice was hoarse and broken, and she hated it. "My name is August." He was still looking out the window. "What do you want?" she asked from instinct, not thought. 6 years had taught her that nothing was free, and the lesson had been taught through a ledger. Ray Tolliver kept records. He truly did, in ballpoint pen, inside a school notebook stored in the kitchen drawer. Every dollar, every meal, every takeout box, every tank of gas used for therapy appointments, even the number of gallons. And whenever she said she wanted another job, wanted to visit someone, wanted anything at all, he opened the drawer. He didn't strike her with the ledger. He only placed it on the table. Gratitude was the longest chain anyone could fasten around another person's neck, because it required no lock. August remained silent long enough for Quinn to believe he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, still watching the rain beyond the glass. "You pour my water. You don't speak to me as though I'm a safe that learned how to walk. You don't stare at my nose." He paused for 1 beat. "You give me 40 minutes of quiet every week in a city that gives me none, and whatever threatens you threatens my quiet." It was the most practical, coldest, least romantic declaration of protection Quinn Ardley had ever heard. There was no night in it, no salvation, no destiny, not 1 sentence about how she deserved a decent life, only a very wealthy man explaining why he maintained his property. She was a light in his hallway, When a light stopped working, he replaced the bulb, and he didn't need the bulb to thank him. And she believed it. She believed it immediately and completely, precisely because it wasn't kind. Because, for 6 years, every kind thing anyone had said to her had eventually revealed itself as a loan with interest. But this wasn't beautiful, wasn't warm, and required nothing from her in return. She rested her head against the seat. Beneath her hand, the dog breathed steadily. The vehicle turned south toward Port Richmond, and Quinn closed her eyes for the first time in 14 hours. The Mercedes stopped in front of a 4-story brick building on Almond Street, and Port Richmond appeared through the glass exactly as it had always been, pretending nothing, apologizing for nothing. Crumbling brick. 3 streetlights along this block had been shot out since summer, and no one had bothered to replace them. The chain-link fence around the front yard was choked with dead vines, dry, twisted, and blackened by rain, looking like something that had been hanged there a long time ago. And Quinn Ardley sat inside the warm cabin scented with leather and sandalwood, her hand still resting on the head of a dog heavier than she was, and felt something she hadn't been prepared to feel that night: shame. She poured $300 bottles of wine for men like him. She knew how to pronounce the names of 8 regions in Piedmont. She knew that table number 9 drank water without ice or lemon. Then she came home to sleep in a building where the staircase smelled of boiled cabbage from the second-floor apartment all year long, even in summer, even when the elderly woman who lived there had been in the hospital for 3 weeks. He opened the door on his side of the vehicle. Quinn said she could make it upstairs by herself. He didn't answer, and he didn't ask. He simply stepped into the rain and walked around the back of the vehicle. Oz remained beside the driver's door, one hand resting lightly inside his coat, his eyes sweeping the length of the street from one end to the other and back again, steady as a lighthouse beam. Bruno remained in the vehicle, and he released a soft whine when the door closed. August followed her up the stairs, and by the first landing, Quinn understood that he wasn't accompanying her. He was clearing the building. At every landing, he stopped for exactly half a second. No longer. His head tilted at the slightest angle. He glanced at every door they passed, and she knew he was reading something there that she hadn't learned to read in 3 years of living in this building. Every blind corner, every dark space beneath the stairs, he measured with his eyes. He drew nothing. He said nothing. He simply climbed slowly, his shadow stretching long across the peeling plaster walls, and Quinn realized that until that night, she had never walked up these stairs without clenching her key between her fingers. At the door to apartment 3B, he looked at the lock for exactly 1 second. He said nothing. "It was what I could afford," Quinn said, before he could speak, her voice sharper than she intended. He nodded. "I know." Then he reached inside his coat. Quinn flinched. She stepped back half a pace, her shoulder striking the doorframe, and one hand had already risen in front of her face before she could think. It was a reflex that hadn't asked permission from her mind. 6 years had carved it into muscle, into tendon, into some place beneath thought itself, and it was still there, loyal and ready, even when the man standing before her had just thrown the person who taught it to her into an alley. August froze. His hand stopped halfway beneath the fabric, and he stood motionless in the dark hallway, looking at that reflex. He studied it carefully, and something passed through those pale green eyes, a darkness sweeping across them and disappearing in less than a second. And it wasn't anger at her. It was something else, something buried very deep, something Quinn had no name for and never would. Bruno sensed it before she did. The dog released a long, low whine that rose from the foot of the staircase through 3 floors of brick. Then August withdrew his hand, very slowly, so slowly that it was almost an apology. And perhaps it was an apology because it was the only kind this man knew how to give. In his hand was a business card, thick paper, plain white, with sharp edges, a telephone number embossed in black at the center. No name, no logo, not another word. He placed it in her hand, and he didn't say a single word about it. "No, call this number if you need anything. No, someone will answer at any hour. No instructions, no reassurance, nothing for her to hold on to." He simply placed it in her palm and turned away. At the top of the stairs, he stopped with one hand resting on the railing, and he didn't look back. "Because this city is full of stray dogs, Quinn," he said. "Sometimes they need to be reminded who keeps the dogs." Then he left. He didn't wait for an answer. He disappeared into the darkness of the hallway before she could fit her key into the lock, and the sound of his shoes faded down 3 floors. Then the door below closed, and there was nothing. Quinn stood alone in the hallway with the card pressed against her chest, and she remained there for a very long time. Then she went inside. She locked the door, and for the first time in 6 years, she didn't wedge a chair beneath the handle, and she didn't lie awake listening to the darkness. She also didn't realize that he had never told her what the card was for. The following morning, Quinn Ardley stood before the cracked bathroom mirror and performed the task she had mastered years earlier and had hoped she would never have to perform again. Concealer, one shade lighter than her skin, went on first, then foundation, then powder, then another layer. She worked for 20 minutes, patiently and meticulously, with the kind of precision only humiliation could teach a person. By the time she finished, her wrist looked like the hand of a department store mannequin. Smooth, colorless, unreal. She pulled down the sleeve of her sweater. She put on the black turtleneck she hadn't touched in 4 years and had thought she had thrown away. At the door, she stopped for 1 second. Then she slipped the pepper spray into her coat pocket beside the white card. The black SUV was parked across the street beside a fire hydrant that hadn't worked in years. Its windows were dark, so dark they didn't even reflect the sky. It was clean. That was the most unnatural thing about it. On this street, a clean vehicle looked as out of place as a piano in a scrapyard. When Quinn stepped down from the final stair, the engine revved softly, briefly. Not aggressively, not as a warning, with nothing behind it at all. It said only one thing, and she understood immediately. I see you. 3 days passed that way. The SUV followed her to the subway station and parked across from the entrance until she boarded. It waited half a block from the grocery store while she bought milk and noodles. It remained in the parking lot of the care facility throughout the 40 minutes she sat with Teddy, and when she came out, it was still there, silent as stone. It never came too close. It never flashed its lights, never sounded its horn, never opened a door. It also never looked away. By the 3rd day, Quinn realized something that frightened even her. She had begun looking for it. She stepped outside, and her eyes automatically swept across the street. And when she saw it, something inside her chest settled, the way a person's shoulders lowered when they entered their own home. She had begun to think of a vehicle without license plates as the safest thing in her life. Then came the 4th day. She arrived at the care facility at 10 o'clock in the morning and found an unfamiliar vehicle parked directly in front of the main entrance. Gray, old, dirty, not the SUV, not belonging to this lot. And the SUV wasn't there. It wasn't there. All the blood in Quinn's body drained into her feet. She stood at the edge of the parking lot with trembling hands, and everything from the past 7 years narrowed into one single point. The double glass doors 100 feet away, behind which sat a man drawing a peer who didn't know how to run. She pulled out the card. She entered the number 1 digit at a time, her finger slipping twice. She pressed the telephone to her ear. It didn't ring, not ringing until no one answered. There was no ringing at all, only a brief silence, then one short, blunt tone. She called again. Nothing. She looked at the screen. Call cannot be completed. A 3rd time. A 4th. On the 5th attempt, she entered the number slowly, reading each embossed digit on the white card, as though the problem lay with her eyes. Call cannot be completed. Quinn sank onto the concrete steps outside the facility beneath the February cold, the card in one hand and the telephone in the other, and she remained there until she understood. It wasn't a number meant for outgoing calls. It only received. A one-way line, running inward but never outward. And she remembered the dark hallway on the 3rd floor, the moment he placed that piece of paper into her palm, and she remembered that he hadn't said a single word. Not one. He had never told her the card was for asking for help. She had assumed that herself. She had written that meaning and attached it to the blank card because that was what a normal person would say, because that was what a kind person would give a woman who had just been trapped between 2 wine racks. She had assumed grace. 6 years. And she still assumed kindness. August Vale hadn't given her a rope to pull. He had given her a name. He had given her a name so that when the call came, and he knew it would come, she would look down at the screen and recognize those digits, and she would know who was calling, and she would know she had to answer. Quinn sat on the cold steps for a very long time, and a new thought began crawling slowly up her spine, one vertebra at a time. If he knew the call would come, then he knew what was coming. The double glass doors opened behind her, and a young woman in blue scrubs stepped outside carrying a stack of towels, walked directly to the dirty gray vehicle, and opened the trunk. A new nurse. Starting today, Quinn rose, brushed off her pants, went inside, and smiled at Teddy as she always did. But the fear remained behind. It had found a place, and it lay down there, and it didn't leave. 61 missed calls. Quinn counted them at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the vinyl kitchen floor, with her back against the refrigerator door, as it trembled faintly, its cold seeping through her nightgown and settling between her shoulder blades. Every call came from an unfamiliar number, and no two numbers were the same, and she understood immediately what that meant. He was borrowing telephones. He was moving from one person to another through a city that had run out of room for him, asking to borrow a telephone, and people lent him theirs because he had once been the Tolliver boy, and he stood there, entering the same number, and they had no idea what they had just handed to whom. 11 voice messages. She listened to them in order, one by one, at the lowest possible volume, the telephone pressed against her ear like a knife. The first message was crying. There were no words for the first 20 seconds, only the sound of a man trying to breathe. Then he said, I'm sorry, Quinn. I'm not well." And his voice broke on the word well. And the part of Quinn's chest she had believed died 4 years earlier stirred once. The third message was someone else. The same throat, the same mouth, but someone else. And that person said things Quinn would never repeat to anyone, then stopped in the middle of a sentence as though someone had just entered the room. In the fifth message, he cried again. He spoke her mother's name. He said, "She wouldn't want to see you like this." And Quinn had to set the telephone on the floor for 30 seconds before she could pick it up again. The eighth message was cold. No crying, no shouting, only a flat voice. "You think that man cares about you? You're nothing but a glass of water to him, Quinn. He drinks, and when he's finished, he leaves it on the table." The ninth and 10th messages contained only breathing. 40 seconds, then 30 seconds. Not one word, only the breathing of someone sitting somewhere in the darkness, holding the telephone and saying nothing. The 11th message, and his voice was sober, completely sober. So sober that Quinn straightened away from the refrigerator door. "Quinn, listen carefully. I couldn't find you. I don't have a car. I don't have money. I've been sleeping on my cousin's sofa in Camden for 3 months, and I don't even know whether you still live in Port Richmond. I swear on my mother's grave. Someone called me. They gave me your address. They told me which shifts you work, which days, what time you finish. They even told me which delivery entrance had no camera. Have you ever wondered why?" Beep. Quinn froze on the kitchen floor. The refrigerator trembled. Outside the window, rain. She sat there and turned 3 possibilities over and over until morning, and she examined them the way a woman did after surviving 6 years by learning to read what no one said aloud. The first possibility was that Ray was lying. He had lied his entire life. He lied about the pills, about the money, about the night in the bathroom. But Ray Tolliver never lied without a reason. He lied to obtain something, always, and this statement gave him nothing. It wouldn't make her sign the paper. It wouldn't make her pity him. It only made her afraid of something other than him, and a man like Ray would never willingly share another person's fear with an invisible rival. The second possibility was that someone wanted to hurt her. Quinn almost laughed as she sat on the kitchen floor. She was 27 years old. She had $340 in her bank account. She owned 1 coat, 2 pairs of work shoes, 1 Polaroid photograph, and 1 brother. No one on this earth wanted anything from her. No one had ever wanted anything from her. That had been the entire shape of her life until now. The third possibility. Someone wanted to hurt August Vale. And if it was the third possibility, then she wasn't the target. She was the instrument. Someone had looked into her life, looked at a tired woman with a brother who needed $2,400 a month, and an ex-husband who was starving. And in all of that, someone had seen not a human being but leverage. Someone had picked up her life, weighed it in their hand, and found that it fit comfortably. Then a thought worse than all the others crawled into her mind. And Quinn hated herself for thinking it, and she thought it anyway. Or he had arranged the entire thing himself. A man who wanted to be needed would create the thing that made people need him. He had been there at exactly the right moment. He had gone down to the cellar at exactly the right moment. He had given her a card she couldn't call, and hadn't told her what it was for. And he had known in advance that a call would come. Quinn sat on the kitchen floor at 4:15 in the morning and looked through the window. Across the street, beneath the rain, the black SUV was still parked there, patient as stone. It had been there all night. Tuesday, 7 o'clock in the evening, and the walnut door opened, and the temperature of the room changed exactly as it had for 3 years. Rare steak, 1 glass of water, no ice, no lemon. Bruno lumbered beneath the table and released a long breath like a sack slowly losing air. Quinn Ardley set the glass on the wooden surface beside his right hand, in its proper place, and she didn't leave. She stood there with the tray pressed against her stomach, listening to her heartbeat in her throat. After 4 sleepless nights, after 61 calls, after a card she couldn't call, she had nowhere left to retreat. "Why don't you drink alcohol?" It was the first personal question she had asked him in 2 years. It fell into the room like a plate striking a tiled floor. Beneath the table, Bruno raised his head. August Vale looked at her for a very long time. He wasn't angry. He only looked, and Quinn felt that gaze pass over her face, her shoulders, the black turtleneck she was still wearing, and she had the sensation of being read from beginning to end like a bill. Then he spoke. "It killed my father." 4 words. He added nothing. No next sentence, no year, no name. He simply placed those 4 words between them and left them there. The silence lasted long enough for Quinn to hear the piano drifting from the main dining room through 2 closed doors. Then she heard her own voice, and she couldn't remember deciding to speak. "It killed my father, too." He didn't turn toward her immediately. He looked at the glass, and the 2 of them remained there, one seated and one standing. On opposite sides of the same hole neither of them had dug. No one touched anyone. No one said, "I understand." No one said, "I'm sorry," because both of them knew those words were meant for outsiders. "When I was 11, he said, "I learned that an apartment can be silent in 2 very different ways." He stopped. He didn't say what the second way was. He never would, not to her, not to anyone. And Quinn understood that immediately, and didn't ask. She simply stood there, and let the sentence pass through her. And somewhere very deep inside her, a fragment of a distant evening in a Port Richmond apartment stirred faintly, and she pressed it back down. "You own 3 casinos," she said. It was the first time she had revealed that she knew anything about him beyond the menu. "You make money from that very thing." "I make money from men who can't control themselves," August said. His voice remained even. "I don't pretend it's clean. I simply don't bring it into this room." Then Quinn asked the real question, the one she had spent 4 nights sharpening while sitting on the cold kitchen floor. "Did you call Ray?" Bruno rose. He didn't growl. He only stood, slowly, 143 pounds lifting from the carpet, and that wrinkled head turned toward her. August set down his knife and fork. He didn't place them down hard. He merely set them beside each other, parallel, correctly, then raised his eyes and looked at her. And there was no anger in those pale green eyes. There was something else, something Quinn wouldn't find the name for until many months later. He was assessing. He was looking at her the way someone looked at a lock that had just been tested, not to blame the lock, but to determine who had tried it and where they had been standing. No. 1 word. And he didn't explain another syllable. He didn't ask why she thought that. He didn't ask who had told her. He didn't say, "I swear." Didn't ask what kind of man she believed him to be. Didn't offer another name for her to suspect instead. He picked up his knife and fork, and he continued eating. And that was why she believed him. She believed him immediately and completely, and she knew exactly why. Because Ray Tolliver had spent 6 years explaining. Ray always had a reason. Ray always had a story, and the story was always 10 minutes long, and it was always a carefully drawn map filled with reasonable turns. And every time, without one exception, it ended at the same destination. Her fault. Guilty people explained. Innocent people continued their meals. Bruno lay down again. He shifted forward half a step and rested his chin on the toe of her black shoe, that warm, heavy weight pressing across her aching toes, and Quinn remained still and allowed him to stay there. "I have 11 more tables," she said softly. He nodded, almost satisfied. She walked out through the walnut door and into the noise and golden light of the main dining room, and she began clearing table number 4. She didn't know that at the far end of the room, beside the bar, a silver-haired woman was watching her through the glass door. Mercy Latham didn't move. She only watched, and she was calculating. Thursday morning, 10:15, Mercy Latham called Quinn, her voice rough and warm as always. "Sweetheart, I'm letting you leave 2 hours early tonight. You've worked 3 nights in a row, and I saw your face yesterday and couldn't bear it. Don't argue with me. I've already told the kitchen." And Quinn Ardley, standing in the tiny kitchen of her Port Richmond apartment with the telephone pressed to her ear, nearly cried. For 3 seconds, She couldn't speak. She had been awake all the previous night, working a double shift at another restaurant in Fishtown from 6 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock at night to make up the quarterly medical payment the facility had reminded her about for the second time. Her telephone battery had died at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, and she had no portable charger and no money to buy one. "Thank you, Mercy," she said. Mercy laughed softly at the other end. "Go home and sleep, sweetheart." 2 empty hours. 2 hours that didn't exist on any schedule in the world. Felix Dre's team followed her work schedule, not her. That was how a system operated, and a system was stronger than a human being in every way except one. It trusted the schedule. The black SUV was parked outside the St. Abel's Hotel at that very moment, patient as stone, waiting for a shift that was supposed to end at 11 o'clock. That shift had ended at 9. Quinn walked to the bus stop. Because 2 hours were 2 hours, and there was something she had postponed for 3 months, and that night was the only night that week when she had them. The self-storage facility in Kensington stood behind a row of abandoned industrial buildings, a 3-story concrete block with an illuminated sign that had lost half its letters. C-14. That was where Quinn kept everything that wouldn't fit inside apartment 3B. 6 boxes of her mother's belongings, sealed with tape since Quinn was 19, and never opened again. And 7 years of Teddy's drawings, stored flat inside 3 shallow boxes, dates written in marker at the corners, because the nurses had run out of space to display them, and Quinn refused to allow anyone to throw away a single page. Concrete corridor. Fluorescent lights overhead flickering in an uneven rhythm. There was no telephone signal down there. There never had been, and her telephone had been dead since the previous afternoon anyway. She raised the metal door of Unit C-14, and its grinding echo traveled through the empty corridor before fading. She sat down, opened the box of drawings, and began searching for a place to fit the new picture of the pier. Then she heard footsteps. Ray Tolliver stood at the far end of the corridor. He was positioned between 2 rows of orange metal doors beneath the flickering light, and Quinn had no idea how long he had been there. In his left hand was the sheet of paper folded into quarters. A ballpoint pen rested in the breast pocket of his shirt, and in his right hand was a sharpened screwdriver, ground against stone, sharpened carelessly, its slanted tip catching one point of light. Not a knife, because a knife had to be purchased, and because this was Ray. "Sign it," he said. His voice wasn't sober. "Not this time. Sign it and I'll disappear. I swear. I swear on my mother's grave, Quinn. Sign it, and I'll leave this city, and you'll never have to see me again." She stood. She stepped backward once, then again, and her shoulder struck a cardboard box stacked high inside the storage unit. It tilted. It fell. The old tape tore open, and the contents spilled across the concrete floor. A sweater, a tin box filled with sewing thread, a notebook with a plastic cover, and among all of it, sliding outward and stopping directly beneath Ray's shoe, was a Polaroid photograph. Quinn knew that photograph. She had carried it in her wallet for 9 years, and had placed it inside this unit only when the film began to peel, and she became afraid she would damage it. 1998. Her mother was laughing, mouth open, not beautiful, real. In her arms was a baby wrapped in a pink blanket, and with her other hand, she was holding the hand of a 4-year-old boy with wild hair named Teddy, the boy who, 13 years later, would leave school to unload cargo at the docks, so he could raise the baby inside that pink blanket. Ray looked down, and he stepped on it. Perhaps he didn't mean to. Perhaps he didn't even see it. He was high, he was moving forward, and the wet sole of his shoe pressed down across the photograph and twisted half a turn. It didn't matter, and that was the moment Quinn Ardley stopped being afraid. She didn't become brave. She wanted to make that clear to herself later, many times. She wasn't brave. She was simply finished. Finished with fear, finished with exhaustion, finished with 6 years, finished with the reflex that raised her hand to protect her face, finished with the voice inside her head warning her not to make him angry, finished with all of it. It drained out of her like water leaving a bathtub, and for 2 seconds she stood there completely empty, hearing clearly the fluorescent light buzzing above her. Then something else entered the space it had left behind, something she had learned piece by piece without ever knowing she was learning it. Through 40 minutes each week inside a walnut-paneled room, watching a man silence an entire dock without ever raising his voice. Absolute calm. Quinn straightened. Her breathing slowed. She looked at the screwdriver, then at the paper, then directly into Ray Tolliver's face, and she held out her hand. "Give me the pen." Ray Tolliver hesitated for exactly 1 beat. Then he pulled the ballpoint pen from his breast pocket and held it out, and he offered it with the hand that wasn't holding the screwdriver, and Quinn realized he was still clear-headed enough to calculate that. She took the pen. He handed her the paper. She unfolded it, pressed it against the surface of the fallen cardboard box, bent beneath the flickering fluorescent light, and signed. She signed Quinn Tolliver, the name she had abandoned 4 years earlier at a plastic table inside the Philadelphia County Courthouse, the name that no longer existed on any of her documents, not on her driver's license, not on her social security card, not on anything a court clerk would use for verification. A sworn affidavit signed under the wrong name was wastepaper. It couldn't be filed. It couldn't reopen any case. It was only ink on paper. Ray leaned down to examine the signature, and he was high, and he saw exactly the name he had wanted to see for 4 years. He saw his wife's name. His face relaxed. All the tension around his eyes dissolved, and for 1 second he looked almost gentle, almost like the man on the front page of the local newspaper with soot covering his face. "Thank you," he said. His voice broke. "Thank you, Quinn." She handed the paper back. Then she spoke. Her voice was flat, so flat that even she didn't recognize it as her own, flat as the surface of a glass of water without ice or lemon, and somewhere very far inside her mind, one small part of Quinn Ardley stood watching and wondered when she had learned to speak that way. "Ray, the court will ask why I withdrew my testimony after 4 years. He stopped, the paper still halfway into his hand. "I'll tell them it was because you held that screwdriver against my throat, inside storage unit C-14. You don't have proof. I have 3 witnesses." She looked over his shoulder. "They're standing behind you." Ray Tolliver turned his head. The corridor was empty. Concrete, orange metal doors, one flickering light, and not a living thing. But he had turned. He turned because in 6 years, he had never once heard Quinn Ardley lie. Not once. She was the only thing in his life that had never shown him 2 faces. And his mind, drowning in whatever he had taken, wasn't quick enough to ask why that night would be different. 1.5 seconds. The pepper spray had been inside her coat pocket for 4 years. It had been there the night August Vale walked up 3 floors and judged the lock on her apartment door. It was there now, and her finger had rested on the cap from the moment she straightened. She sprayed him. She tore the paper from his hand. She ran. She ran down the concrete corridor, her shoes striking the floor, the echoes chasing behind her, and behind them came the sound of a man collapsing among the cardboard boxes that had belonged to her mother, a woman dead for 20 years. She reached the emergency exit, shoved the horizontal bar, stumbled into the wet parking lot, and stood beneath the rain with her back against the concrete wall, breathing, looking at the crumpled paper in her hand, and she didn't shed a single tear. She survived by telling a lie, exactly the way August Vale ruled half the port of Philadelphia. Felix Dre arrived 4 minutes later. 4 minutes. Enough time for everything to be over. He didn't run. He parked about 65 feet away, stepped out, and walked into the corridor with the manner of a man going to collect a package. His thin framed glasses didn't fog with a single breath. He looked at Ray Tolliver writhing on the floor among the belongings of a woman who had been dead for 20 years. He looked at the screwdriver lying about 3 feet away. He looked at Quinn Ardley standing against the wall outside, her hair plastered to her forehead, her chest rising and falling. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't ask what had happened. He adjusted his glasses with one finger, and his eyes settled on the crumpled paper in her fist, and remained there for exactly 1.5 seconds. Then he said the only sentence: "You handled the variable yourself." In the world this man inhabited, that was the highest praise that existed. There was nothing above it. A person could spend an entire lifetime inside August Vale's organization and never hear those words. Then Felix took a telephone from his inner pocket and began making calls. There was a gray wool blanket around her shoulders, and Quinn couldn't remember who had placed it there. The vehicle without license plates was heading west, leaving Kensington behind, and the crumpled, wet paper was still in her hand, the ink blurred where she had signed. She didn't let it go. Felix Dre sat in the front passenger seat beside the driver, and he spoke over his shoulder in the voice of someone reading a weather report for a city he had never visited. "The cameras have been handled. Not before. After." He allowed the sentence 1 beat to settle. "We don't cut the power to a building and sit there waiting for something to happen, ma'am. We clean up what has already happened. Those are 2 different professions. The police, they won't come." Quinn looked down at her hands. At some point, they had stopped trembling. "Mr. Vale has requested that this problem be permanently relocated." Felix continued. He'll receive treatment. His leg, and other things. Afterward, he'll work on an offshore oil rig in Louisiana. He'll have a job. He'll have 3 meals a day, a bed, and someone checking his blood every week, which is more than he has had in 4 years. He won't have a telephone. He won't return to Philadelphia. For how long? Felix adjusted his glasses, and Quinn saw his finger in the rearview mirror, and she saw his eyes as well, and there was nothing inside them. You're asking the wrong question, ma'am. Then he turned back toward the road, and no one spoke again. Quinn sat there and waited for the horror. She waited for it very seriously, almost politely, the way someone waited for a guest who had already said they were coming. Because she was a good person. She knew exactly what she was supposed to feel now. Society had taught her very carefully. Through St. Anne's Church, through movies, through the women in the support group she had attended exactly 3 times before she stopped going. She was supposed to feel guilty. She was supposed to feel that she had become something else. She was supposed to beg for him. It didn't come. It didn't come, and she waited longer, and still it didn't come. What came instead was a deep, dark, absolute relief, rising inside her chest like warm water being poured into a vessel that had been dry for 6 years. 6 years. 6 years of sleeping with a knife beneath her pillow and a chair wedged under the door handle. 6 years of waking at 3 o'clock in the morning to check the lock she had already checked at 2. 6 years of mapping every room she entered according to the number of exits. The vehicle climbed onto the bridge. The city lights slid across the glass to her right in long golden streaks, and Quinn Ardley watched them and realized she was smiling. She sat with that knowledge for a while, honestly, without looking away from it. Then she realized a second thing. She had no intention of stopping. The stray dog was gone. But someone had let it loose, and Quinn still didn't know who. 3 days later, Quinn Ardley tied on her apron and stepped onto the floor of the Cartwright room, and no one asked where she had been. She worked the entire shift. She poured water for table number 9, and he said nothing, and neither did she. And at the end of the shift, close to midnight, Mercy Latham placed a cup of hot tea on the bar for her, exactly as she had done every night for 3 years, and for other girls before Quinn throughout the 11 years she had worked there. Black tea, 2 cubes of sugar, hot enough that it had to be blown on. Quinn picked it up, then she set it down. Who changed my shift on Thursday? Mercy didn't answer. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't ask Quinn to repeat herself. She only reached beneath the bar for her cigarettes, then walked toward the alley door, and she didn't look back to see whether Quinn followed, because she knew Quinn would. Outside in the alley, rain. Mercy lit a cigarette beneath the awning, her silver hair pressed close to her head by the damp air, then took out her telephone, opened it, and handed it to Quinn. A sent message. Thursday, 4:12 in the afternoon. 6 words. The girl is at the Kensington storage facility. Quinn stood there, unable to speak. The cigarette burned between Mercy's lips, and she didn't remove it. And the ash lengthened, and she began to tell the story in that rough voice of hers. Calmly, without a single tear, the voice of someone who had told it to herself so many times that every edge had been worn smooth. I had a son. His name was Wendell. He was 24 years old, and he unloaded cargo at Pier 4. 10 years ago, they told me a crane hook had failed. They told me it was an accident, sweetheart, a workplace accident, no one's fault. They gave me $4,000. Then they put his name on a bronze plaque mounted to the concrete wall beside the crane. And do you know what? I had to ask permission to see it. I had to call 3 days in advance, just to stand there and look at my son's name. I asked questions. For 10 years, Quinn, I questioned every person still alive who had been there that day. I found 7 of them. I sat in their kitchens, drank their coffee, listened to them speak in circles for 2 hours. And every one of those 7 people ended with the same sentence. Ask August Vale. She drew on the cigarette. I didn't have a gun. I was 58 years old, and the joints in my fingers hurt so badly I couldn't open a jar of pickles. I couldn't kill him. I knew that from the first year. So I found work at the restaurant where he ate dinner every Tuesday. And I waited. For 11 years, I poured his water, wiped down that table, and waited. I needed him to take his hand out of his coat pocket in front of someone else. Just once. I needed a witness. I needed the police to have a reason to enter that room, but he never did anything. He only sat there and drank water. Never. Not once in 11 years did he lose control. She turned toward Quinn, and half the cigarette had burned away, and it was still between her lips. until I understood that I didn't need to provoke him. I needed to find someone he couldn't bear to see hurt. I searched this entire city, Quinn, then I found you." And Quinn Ardley stood beneath the awning in the rain and understood. She hadn't been chosen because she was special. She hadn't been chosen because she was strong, or kind, or deserving. She had been chosen because she was pitiable, a mother who died when she was 9, a father who died in prison, a brother who needed $2,400 a month, an ex-husband who was starving and desperate and knew the way through the delivery entrance. Every tragedy in her life, each piece of it, had been picked up by someone, examined, measured, and weighed, and together they had formed the perfect weapon. Mercy Latham had made tea for her every night for 3 years. She hadn't been raising a daughter. She had been maintaining a gun. Then Quinn remembered the drawing. It was still in her coat pocket, rolled up, crumpled, damp. She pulled it out with fingers that had gone numb and opened it beneath the alley light. A pier. Gray water, 4 cranes rising like 4 long necks. And in the lower corner, painted yellow against the concrete, the number 4. Drawn again and again for an entire month, refusing to draw anywhere else. "Mercy," Quinn said, and her voice no longer sounded like her own. "My brother worked at Pier 4. Mercy looked at the drawing. She looked at it for a very long time. The cigarette burned down to her fingers, and she didn't notice. And Quinn saw her skin redden, and still she didn't pull it away. "I know," she said. "Of course I know, sweetheart." Rain struck the metal awning. He was there that day. He was the one who pulled my boy out. She dropped the cigarette into a puddle. "Why do you think it was so easy for me to find you?" Tuesday, 7 o'clock in the evening. Quinn Ardley pushed open the walnut door and entered the private room, and there was no glass of water on her tray. She set a cup of tea before August Vale. Black tea, 2 cubes of sugar, still steaming. He looked at it. Beneath the table, Bruno rose. "This is the tea she made for me every night for 3 years, Quinn said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced it for 48 hours. "Her name is Mercy Latham. She's been wiping down your table for 11 years, August, waiting for you to pay for what happened to her son at Pier 4. She knows about the crane hook. And now, so do I." She called Ray. She gave him my home address, my work schedule, and told him which delivery entrance had no camera. On Thursday, she sent me home 2 hours early to create an opening your people didn't know existed. She placed one hand on the back of the chair across from him. Her weapon was the shift schedule, Mr. Vale. She brought you down with a duty roster. August didn't move. But the temperature inside the room dropped, and Quinn felt it. And the frightening thing was that she recognized herself feeling it. 3 years earlier, she wouldn't have noticed anything. Now she could read him. "Why are you telling me?" "Because I don't want to owe you." "You don't owe me anything." "I know, you already said that. In the car, I remember every word." She didn't sit down. "But I still owe you, because you keep giving. That's how it works, whether you want it to or not. And the only way I can stop owing you is to give you something you don't have. Now you owe me." The silence lasted long enough for her to hear the tea cooling. "What do you want?" "I want her to live." And she didn't beg. That was what would continue to surprise her about herself many months later. She didn't beg with a single word. "If you kill her, I'll be the only person left alive who knows about this. And then you'll have to sit at this table, in that exact chair, and decide what to do with me." She allowed the sentence to settle. "And I don't want you to have to make that decision, August, because I don't know what you would choose. And I don't want to know." Something passed across his face. Not anger. He was offended, but not for the reason she thought. "You believe I would enter you into a ledger. I survived a man who recorded every dollar he spent on me," Quinn said, in ballpoint pen. Inside, a school notebook kept in the kitchen drawer. "Every meal, every drive to take my brother to therapy, including the number of gallons of gasoline. He never struck me with that ledger. He only opened the drawer and placed it on the table. 6 years. So yes, I believe that. I believe it about everyone, and I'll believe it until I die." August Vale placed both hands on the table, large, calloused, the knuckles thickened, and he laid them flat against the walnut surface like 2 pieces of evidence. "Don't insult me by comparing me to a man who has to hurt women to feel large." His voice wasn't loud. It was never loud. "I don't keep accounts with the people I choose to protect. The debt belonged to him because he trespassed. It has been paid. You don't owe me 1 cent, and you never did." And Quinn looked at him. And for the first time, she saw through everything. Through the suit tailored in Naples, through half the port of Philadelphia, through the reputation that made 40 men fall silent in the fog, through the broken nose no one had ever reset, and she saw what no one else in the city had ever seen. A man made utterly alone by his own power, fiercely guarding the last few quiet corners remaining in his life. 40 minutes every Tuesday. One dog. One table. He hadn't saved her to possess her. He had saved her because he had once been 11 years old inside an apartment in Kensington, and there were sounds a person never stopped hearing. Not even at 34. Not even after an entire city had learned to lower its voice in his presence. He looked at the silk scarf around her neck. "Take off the scarf, Quinn." Her hand rose to her throat. The bruises still looked terrible. "Take it off." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and it was something Quinn had never heard before. "You have no reason to hide the marks of a battle you survived. Let them look. Let them know you're still standing." She removed the scarf. Slowly. The purple and yellow bruises appeared beneath the golden light of the room. Fading now, but still there, shaped like fingers. She felt exposed. But beneath his gaze, she didn't feel weak. She felt seen. "Bring me the bill," he said, "and put away the pepper spray. You don't need it anymore." "No," Quinn said. And for the first time in 2 years, August Vale smiled. Mercy Latham left for Scranton on a Monday morning in early March, and she traveled by bus because she refused the car they offered her. Not an oil rig, not any kind of vessel offshore. A 2-room ground-floor apartment with a patch of backyard large enough to grow tomatoes if she wanted, and a monthly allowance deposited into her account on the first day of every month by a transportation company that didn't exist in any Pennsylvania business registry. And at St. Dominic Cemetery, north of the city, there was a new headstone. Granite, hand-carved, not the stamped aluminum marker they had driven into the ground 10 years earlier, when $4,000 had been enough for the funeral, but not enough to have a name carved properly. Mercy had spent 10 years saving for it and had never managed to gather enough, because every time she came close, something happened. A tooth, a roof, a winter. She thanked no one. She stood there for a long time beneath the gray sky with her hands inside her coat pockets, and she read the name, Wendell Latham. She read it again and again, as though making certain it had been written correctly, and perhaps that was the only thing she had ever wanted during those 10 years, simply for his name to be written correctly, somewhere she didn't have to call 3 days in advance for permission to see. Quinn asked August why. She asked him one Tuesday night after setting down his glass of water and not walking away. He didn't answer immediately. He looked through the window for a while before speaking. "She waited 10 years to look me directly in the face, and throughout those 10 years, not one person in the world knew she was waiting," he said. "She poured my water every Tuesday, and I never knew. Very few people possess that kind of patience, Quinn. I don't kill patience." Then, after a long pause, he added one sentence she wasn't prepared to hear. "And that crane hook didn't fail. Someone signed an approval allowing it to run for one more shift." Quinn stood still. "Who?" He didn't answer. He picked up his knife and fork and continued eating, exactly as he always did. But that night he didn't finish his meal, and it was the first time in 3 years that Quinn cleared a plate with food still on it from table number 9. August stood in the backyard of the care facility, and sunlight poured over the scorched yellow lawn as though the sky were trying to make amends for an entire winter. The 143-pound Italian Mastiff approached slowly, his claws scraping softly against the concrete. He stopped in front of Teddy's chair and studied him for a long time with that ancient, mournful gaze, as though reading something only dogs could read. Then he lifted his wrinkled head and placed it in Teddy's lap, and he remained that way for 40 minutes. Teddy laughed. His whole body burst into it, shoulders, hands, his head falling backward, holding nothing in reserve, and Quinn had to turn her face away for a moment. He called the dog by the name of a Croatian cargo ship that had entered the port of Philadelphia. Adriatic. He said it in the steady voice he used when reciting lists of ships. And Bruno, a dog who had obeyed no one but August Vale throughout his 8 years of life, raised his head and responded. August stood about 50 feet away beneath the shade of a maple tree with both hands in his pockets. He didn't come closer. He said nothing. He only watched. And Quinn watched him watching them, and she understood that this was the closest the man had ever come to what other people called happiness, and that he wouldn't take another step because one more step might break it. 6 months later, the Philadelphia summer had ripened, and a rainstorm was lashing against the windows of the Cartwright room, and the dining room was nearly empty. Quinn Ardley had changed. She had negotiated a raise with hotel management in April, a conversation she wouldn't have possessed the backbone to begin 1 year earlier, and she had sat inside that room with both hands laid flat on the table and hadn't blinked once. When the brokers in the outer dining room crossed the line with the younger servers, she silenced them with one flat, cold look, without saying a word, and they lowered their voices without understanding why. She had learned from a master. Teddy had moved to a better facility in Bryn Mawr, one with a real art room, northern light, and an easel he didn't have to share with anyone. Quinn didn't ask who was paying. She left it unspoken, not because she feared owing a debt, but because she had come to understand that some gifts remained gifts only as long as no one named them. Table number 9. August wore reading glasses as he studied a ledger, that rare concession to age making him look strangely more like a professor than a man who could silence an entire harbor. Bruno snored beneath the table. Quinn brought out 2 glasses of water. He looked up and raised an eyebrow at the second glass. "The new floor manager says I've earned a break," she said, and without waiting to be invited, she slid into the chair across from him. Mercy still called. Every Sunday, precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening, and the 2 women spoke about tomatoes, the weather in Scranton, and everything except the one thing neither of them had yet named, and perhaps never would. August looked at Quinn for a long time. The skin of her neck, clear and unmarked, the way she held his gaze without blinking once, and a slow, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, transforming his entire face, making the broken nose look more like a mark of character than a warning. "You're breaking the rules, Quinn. In my territory, I make the rules." They weren't a couple in any sense the world would understand. No flowers, no dates in restaurants where other people could watch, no declarations, no kisses, not once, and perhaps there never would be. Only 2 people bound together by a shared understanding of the violence governing the world outside that walnut door. Quinn knew exactly who August Vale was. She knew there was blood in his tips. She knew the men guarding his vehicle had done things no court would forgive. And she accepted it, because she had learned in the hardest possible way that the good men of this world could be monsters hidden very carefully behind a closed door and a charming smile. Ray Tolliver had once been a heroic firefighter loved by the entire neighborhood, with his photograph on the front page of the local newspaper. August Vale was a devil whose face the entire city knew, and if she had to choose, Quinn Ardley would rather choose the devil who kept his promises. He raised his glass. Water. Not alcohol. Never alcohol. The glasses touched with one clear, sharp sound that cut through the rain. "To the sanctuary," he said quietly. "To the sanctuary," she replied. Rain struck the windows outside. Inside the walnut-paneled room, the world was complete, merciless, and safe. If Quinn and August's story has kept you here until the very final line, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day you can hear more moving and compelling stories. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Do you think Quinn made the right choice? And if you were in her place, would you sit in the chair across from table number 9? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because every line you write is read and deeply appreciated. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.